Okay, hello there Hollows and welcome to another video. Sorry, hello puppets, that's what I'm calling you people for these Lies of P videos. So then, in this video today, I'm going to be giving my final thoughts on Lies of P after finally beating the game. Now, I'd like to start this off by because I know a lot of people are going to be coming to watch this video who probably are not as, are not massive subscribers of the channel and have not watched all my videos on all the Dark Souls games and everything. I am a Dark Souls veteran, I would say. Personally, I have beaten the original Dark Souls probably 20 times, Dark Souls 2 3 times now, Dark Souls 3 twice, Elden Ring twice. I didn't like Sekiro, not because I wasn't good at it, but because I just generally didn't enjoy the aesthetic of the game, and that whole kind of feudal Japan setting was not really for me. It's nothing to do with the combat, clearly, as I will get to in a second, because Lies of P has a lot of those Sekiro kind of mechanics, those parry mechanics, which I would not have thought would be something I would enjoy in a game. However, because I didn't like Sekiro, so therefore I never really got to the point with that game where I was enjoying the combat that much, because just generally the game didn't appeal to me. The story, the character, the lore, it's just not for me. I played Wolong Fallen Dynasty and I never beat the game because of that kind of thing. It was just that I didn't enjoy the story that was being told. Even though I did enjoy the gameplay and the combat in that game, I never beat it because of that. Just the story, the characters, the setting, the world, it was not really appealing to me, and therefore it didn't draw me in the way that games like Dark Souls tend to, or Bloodborne, or Demon Souls, or all that. So, Lies of P comes out, and honestly, it is not a game that I was... It was on my radar, yeah, because I tend to follow a lot of Souls-like games. But after the track record of a lot of Souls-like games that came out and just... they looked good in the trailers, and then you play them, and you move your character around, and you think... it's just the movement of your character, it just doesn't feel good. And one thing that I think has always been lacking in every single Souls-like game is a proper stamina management system. And Lies of P utilizes a stamina management system and combines it with the combat of Bloodborne and Sekiro in the most amazing, perfect way, with silky smooth gameplay. Moving your character around in this game feels absolutely perfect. It feels just as good as the original Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, Demon Souls, Bloodborne. They all have that silky smooth movement mechanics and combat which feels intuitive and responsive, which in my opinion the only person who's ever been able to get that right is Hidetaka Miyazaki. Whenever he directs a game or has a very heavy-handed involvement in the process of a game, you tend to get that silky smooth feel. Armored Core 6 managed to capture that, despite the fact that it was not a Dark Souls game, because Hidetaka Miyazaki somehow has this wizardry with his games that he has a massive involvement in, where he manages to make the game feel really responsive, moving your character and everything, and just the combat systems feel fantastic. Now, Lies of P somehow manages to achieve that, despite the fact that it's not developed by From Software, it's developed by Neowiz. And they don't, they've only made, well, Low Boss said in a video that they've only actually made one other game before that. I don't know what that is, but I thought this was their first game, but it's obviously their second game, but I'm assuming their first game clearly was not that successful because I couldn't find it anywhere. So, there you go. So, they've somehow managed to do some wizardry to make Lies of P feel as responsive as all of the Souls games, in my personal opinion. Now, I'm going to say something here. There are people out there who will tell you that the game feels clunky, or there's something wrong with it, or it just doesn't feel as good as Souls. They are liars, okay? As someone who has spent thousands of hours in Dark Souls games, the movement in Lies of P came second nature to me. Moving the character around, everything, doing every single action, it all felt silky smooth, completely responsive, and if you've played a lot of Dark Souls 1 and 3 and Elden Ring, you will immediately feel at home once you have the controller in your hands and you start moving the character around, it feels perfect. Now, I know I've spent several minutes at the beginning of this video talking about this, but it's a massive deal, okay? It really is. It's a huge thing. It cannot be understated, and honestly, currently, every single person who I have seen who is saying that about Lies of P has always said, it's just not as good as FromSoft. And that approach is terrible, and is what creates a toxic atmosphere in a gaming community when you're not willing to accept something new coming in. And Lies of P, it is developed by Neowiz Games. It is not developed by From Software, and there are issues in this game. It is not a perfect game. It's an incredible game. It is one of my favourite games of the year, but it is not perfect. And that's because nothing's perfect, especially when you're being created by a team like Neowiz, who are clearly very new onto the scene. They don't have all of the experience that From Software have in the gaming industry, even though I'm sure there's some incredibly talented developers over there, but they don't have all that experience and that massive track record, so they have to, and I think the best thing to do with a game like Lies of P is just trust that the developers know what they're doing. Because clearly there are so many things right in Lies of P. They are clearly very talented developers, and therefore I generally trust that a lot of the things that they've made in the game, a lot of the decisions in the game, are made because they wanted that to be the case. And therefore there are some things in the game that I don't necessarily agree with. However, if a From Software game came out, I'm sure a lot of people would excuse some of this game's shortcomings and put it down to, well, From Software are incredibly talented developers, so therefore surely they wanted that to be the case, or they wanted that to be there because that's part of their vision for the game. In my personal opinion, I am giving Neowiz Games that same approach. I'm looking at the game through that same lens because I want to trust them and think they clearly have created a very amazing game here. They want to tell a story. The world feels incredibly immersive, and therefore I'm going to trust them. I'm going to think, okay, they know what they're doing. So I think some of the things in this game, even though there are flaws, which I'll get to soon, I'm going to trust them with that, and if they actually genuinely are issues they didn't intend to be in the game, I'm sure they'll be fixed. But I do not want them to cave in to that peer pressure. Now, I've mentioned this in a previous video, so I don't really want to stay on this topic for too long, but I really hope they don't cave into peer pressure and change things because other people are saying, well, it should be this way, it should be this way. You know what, don't trust the community. Don't trust the community. The community does not know what it wants half the time. And Lies of P is a fantastic game. And like I said, if there are genuine issues in the game that do need to be addressed, I think Neowiz will address them. However, until then, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt with some issues. Anyway, now that's all over. Let's get on to another thing which I think is incredibly good with this game, and that's the visual aesthetics. I've talked about the game feel now. It feels fantastic. I'm not going to touch on it again because it does feel fantastic, and I highly recommend, if you haven't played this game, give it a chance. And when you move your character around, you'll realize that it feels fantastic. One actually additional point that I forgot to mention there is the controls. I love that the game uses the same control scheme as the original Dark Souls. I think that's fantastic. It's an absolutely perfect control scheme, and it's part of what made the game feel second nature to me straight away as soon as I got my hands on it. But again, I'm going to move past that now. The visual aesthetic of this game, I think, is awesome. It takes that Bloodborne approach, but fuses it with this puppet kind of setting, which is really cool. Obviously, the game is influenced by the story of Pinocchio, and the puppets are really cool. And they've then genuinely managed to make some of the puppets look really creepy and eerie in this way that I never thought they'd genuinely be able to do in this kind of game. But they've managed to mix it with this really cool horror aesthetic, which does look really good, and it fuses together with that Bloodborne setting absolutely perfectly. The boss design in this game, and I'm talking visually here, is, like I said, absolutely fantastic as well. That kind of eerie puppet approach is really cool, and there are some really creative other designs which are not fused with puppets, and they look really cool as well. I think the bosses play really good as well for the most part. I'm going to get into a couple of examples of bosses that don't play as well in a minute, but first of all, there are some absolutely classic boss fights in this game which I think are some of the best boss fights I have played in a video game. Examples of that are the scrapped Watchman fight, which is early on in the game. It's absolutely phenomenal. That was the moment where Lies of P just sold itself to me. After beating that boss using the parry design, or sorry, the parry mechanic, I think it just it played so well. And when you do manage to perfect guard some of the enemy's attacks, it is incredibly satisfying in the same way that I'm sure Sekiro would be if I managed to master the combat in that game, if I end up, which I'm considering going back and playing Sekiro now after mastering Lies of P. I think it still captures that fantastically satisfying combat loop that games like that Sekiro clearly have, because that's what other people have said. And Dark Souls, it has that same satisfying mechanic when you truly master enemies' attacks and they're attacking you and you're dodging or parrying or anything, and you just get a true mastery of a boss fight. When you finally beat it, it is incredibly rewarding. Other examples of some fantastic bosses are Fallen Archbishop Andreas and the Laxia boss fight. Both of those are absolutely incredible examples of truly bosses that seem like an insurmountable challenge when you first go up against them, but then when you finally start to master the attacks, it's just absolutely incredible. Like Fallen Archbishop Andreas. First of all, I thought, oh shit, this boss is just a fucking nightmare. And then I beat the first phase and I was like, oh yes, I'm glad I managed to master that fight, but it wasn't really too tough. Then the second phase hits and I was like, shit, okay, I need to clearly memorize that first phase way more than I did. And then when I finally got to that point, like literally, I couldn't get the Fallen Archbishop Andreas past 30% health my first couple of attempts. But then by the end of the boss fight, I managed to beat Fallen Archbishop Andreas without taking a single hit in my final attempt when I finally managed to beat him. And that is just, honestly, that is an amazing feeling when you can do that and you get that level of mastery of a boss fight that you didn't think you could achieve the first time you walked into that boss room. You're thinking, oh god, I'm never going to do that. But then when you get to that level of mastery, it is just so good and so incredibly satisfying, and Lies of P achieves that same amazing feeling you get when you play Dark Souls or Dark Souls 2 or any of those kind of Souls games. You get that true feeling in the same way because nothing in this game feels unfair, for the most part. There's a caveat there. We'll get to that in a minute. But for the most part, you never feel like a challenge is unfair because you have the tools at your disposal to always manage to outmaneuver the opponent when you understand the enemy's attacks. And that's the main fantastic thing that the game has, is because you always feel like no matter what, you have the tools at your disposal to be able to get through any encounter faultless. If you knew what you were doing, if you knew every single enemy attack, you could get through every single boss fight in the game without taking a single hit. Again, caveat, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, excuse me for the cough. I'm not editing it out because I'm not editing this video as much because I don't have the time. But characters and lore in this game are also done fantastically. You really do feel engrossed in the world. And yes, it's a similar world to Bloodborne. It is. They've clearly taken a lot of influence from that game. I would say in some moments, too much so. However, Bloodborne is a masterpiece. And realistically, if you're borrowing things from a masterpiece, there isn't always a reason why you should change them. And clearly Lies of P did want to be a similar game to Bloodborne. So therefore, there are some things that I understand why they didn't change. But there are a couple. I think one is having people behind windows. I just think is like, okay, that's just a step too far. It's like you're just ripping the game off now. Like at that point when you're giving the characters behind the windows with a silhouette behind the windows, okay, it's just a bit too much. And also I think how you got some of the characters behind the windows who are like coughing and things, and it's like, okay, it's a plagued world, I get it, but still I think you're borrowing a little bit too much. I'd also go as far as to say having like the dead horses lying around the place and chariots and things. I understand that it is still like same kind of Victorian aesthetic. However, I just think there are some environments where I'm thinking it's just too similar. Another example of this is the early forest section in the game. When you get to the first forest section, you are at a bonfire, and then you go down some forest areas. There's a few, enemies there, and then after about 10 minutes of gameplay, you go up, and then there's a lift which takes you back up and opens up a shortcut. That exact level design there is exactly the same as the forest area in Bloodborne. The shortcut is identical. The lift going up, the aesthetic of the room you're in is identical. And the second I saw that door there, I thought, okay, I know exactly what this is going to be. It's the same as that Bloodborne shortcut. I'm not sure if you know what I'm talking about. I think if you've played the game, you'll know what I'm talking about here. But both forest areas in Lies of P and Bloodborne are very similar, and they have an exact identical shortcut, which I think is just a step too far again, where it's like, okay, at this point you are literally copying the layout of Bloodborne. That's when it gets to just too similar territory, in my opinion. But again, I understand it's, if something's broken, so if something's not broken, you don't need to fix it, do you? So I get it, but still I think there could have been a bit more creativity there, and in certain environments I think maybe they could have spiced things up a little bit to give the game a little bit more of its own identity. I think if they'd leaned a bit more into the puppet and carnival aesthetic, in some places maybe the game would have got a bit more of its own visual identity. It's one thing I'm looking forward to if they do a sequel, is this game actually managing to create a world that feels more like its own. Even though this still does have its own world, I think, it's a bit too similar in some places. But saying that though, I cannot fault the game's level design, because even though it does copy a couple of things here and there are some places where it doesn't, and the level design for the most part in this game is flawless. I think there's never a time when you're going too long without feeling like you have a shortcut back. There's never too long without a bonfire, and I wouldn't say there are too many bonfires either. I think there's the perfect amount of bonfires spread throughout this game, which makes it just, you've got a challenge in some places, yes, but always when you get to that point where you're thinking, I'm running out of resources here, there's a bonfire placed right there, and it's absolutely perfect. I would not criticize this at any point. Boss runs as well, for the most part, are good. There's never any boss runs which I think are just bullshit, and you can always run past the enemies. Again, there's a couple of exceptions where I think you have to run potentially a little bit too far, but I think for the most part, you're good. You're good. There's nothing that I suggest would be fixed there. I think, like I said, there's a couple of examples where maybe it's a little bit too far, but I wouldn't say it's bullshit territory at any point in this game. Weapon variety is something I also think is fantastic. Now, build variety is a whole other thing, but weapon variety I think is good. You have a wide amount of weapons. Some of them are very creative, like a fire axe or flame salamander sword, or some really cool things which are incredibly creative, have really cool movesets that always feel fun to use. Build variety though is something I just think I'm not sure about personally. I think there should be a little bit more build variety. I personally would add one additional playstyle to this game. I think magic would be a good way to go. Give the game a bit of magic, even if they try and approach it a bit differently to Dark Souls. A variant of a magic setup would be appreciated in this game, because I think, especially with how linear this game is, which I'm going to get to in a second, I think having limited build variety is also definitely to this game's detriment. Again, this is on the topic of build variety. The leveling and skill system is incredibly fun, and it does add a lot of replayability, whereas the build variety is obviously lesser, so there's less options for builds. However, skills does allow you to have some interesting challenge runs which would not normally be available in a regular Dark Souls game. The leveling system is very good as well. It's very similar to Dark Souls and Bloodborne. It's basically taken from there. It's pretty much identical. But the skill system, adding the using the quartz to add like blood vials and do things like increase your dodge and things, are appreciated. I have never ever had an issue with dodging. However, People have said that the dodging in this game is not good, and the game should start you off with the upgraded dodge that you can get utilizing the skill tree system. Now, I am split on this. I understand that it is something that's been requested a lot, so I do understand that clearly if there's a big cry for it, maybe it's something the developers should consider. However, I personally feel like you don't need to dodge in the game, so it shouldn't be essential. I beat this game by barely ever dodging. I was just perfect parrying, perfect guarding pretty much every attack that I got, and that I was perfectly fine with it. Yes, I did have to use the dodge sometimes, but it was never essential. There's always every single opportunity, with one caveat, which I'm going to get to in a second. Every opportunity I had to dodge, I could have just perfect guarded instead, and I would have been fine. I think this is part of the reason why I do think they should potentially increase the perfect guard window, to therefore make people want to or feel more comfortable using that as an option instead of dodging. I think if people stop trying to dodge and instead master the attacks and utilize the perfect guard, I think they'll have a better time with this game. Now then, to briefly go back to leveling, which I mentioned before, one thing I forgot to mention there was scaling. Issues with the scaling. Now, I did mention this in things that should be fixed. I do think this is just generally something that Neowiz overlooked, and that is that if you have an S rating in a certain category for a weapon, the damage bonus which you get from having, your stats high can be weaker if you have an S ranking in one category than if you have a C and a B in a different category. So in two categories. So let's say you are going for motivity and you have an S ranking in motivity. You will deal less damage than if you have a B ranking in motivity and a C ranking in technique, and then level both of those statistics the same amount. This is clearly something which is overlooked, in my opinion, because it should never be the case, really. I think if you're going to go for a motivity build, putting points in motivity is the way to go. If you're going to go for a technique build, putting points in technique is the way to go. So I think that's something that I think it will be fixed. I'm almost certain that'll be fixed, because that's just saying clearly that it would be easy for the developers to overlook that. So I think that's something that's going to be fixed. But if it isn't, that is something I do think is definitely an issue with this game. Now, going back to, again, the world and level design, the game is incredibly linear. I think this is, for me personally, this is Lies of P's greatest flaw. Is it being incredibly linear. It's more linear than Dark Souls 3. There are some optional bosses, and there are some different choices you can make in the game to allow you to fight different bosses or things like this. But the game is still incredibly linear. Generally, you go through one area, at the end of it, go to another area. At the end of that area, get to another area. Then go back to the hotel, open a different door. Then one area, then another area, another area, another area. There is never a point where you can choose to do the areas in a different order. There might be a hidden boss in one of these areas. There might be some hidden treasure. There might be a side quest you can do in that area, but everything is always A to B, to C, to D, to E, blah, 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 blah. This is its biggest flaw. As I said in my previous video, I personally think if they add additional content to this game, it should be attached to earlier areas. So therefore, you can go and do that DLC content at a certain point in the game, then go back to the main path, which will add additional branches to the otherwise linear path, which would just increase the game's replayability and allow you to do things in a different order, or allow more optional content to be accessible to people if they don't want to do certain things. Personally, I would like it if they added in some areas for free, as opposed to making you pay for it like From Software do with their DLCs. I think this game does need it. It's definitely a lengthy game, don't get me wrong. There's a good amount of content here, but the problem is it's all in an A to B fashion, as opposed to being able to do things in different orders. I think that's a big issue, and I think it's definitely going to hinder the replayability of this game. Now, talking about I talked about the visual design earlier and how it's very influenced by the world of Bloodborne. However, I do think visually this does get samey, in my opinion. I think it runs into, again, the same issue Bloodborne did have, where after a point, that kind of Victorian aesthetic starts to wear thin. And I think that's the same here in Lies of P. There is a point, I'd say around at the halfway point of the game, when you start to think, okay, these Victorian streets, they're getting a bit boring now. I would kind of appreciate something a bit different, and then you don't get it. Then you get a swamp, which also looks shit, but you know, it's still a change from the regular pace. But I do think there's a little bit too much of that Victorian street aesthetic going on in the game, which I think, again, it's another flaw in the game. I think DLC again could definitely help fix this, where if you add DLC to the first, I don't know, the fourth act of the game, you can go and choose to do this DLC, take you to a different visually pleasing location, then go back to that same Victorian streets which you'd be having normally. Now, aside from that though, I think the world does look really, really good. Like I said, it's just that I think it gets a bit samey after a bit. Now, talking about something completely different, voice acting in this game. I think the voice acting for the most part is good. You got Annette Badland, who played a Slovene in Doctor Who, which is cool to see her here. That's the only place I know her from, but she's here, and that's cool. But you've also got some other more established voice actors. There's a lot of voice actors who've been in Elden Ring and the Souls franchise, which is really cool to see them come back. It's almost like an Easter egg for people who know that, but most people aren't going to know that, and it's pretty cool. However, I do think the voice acting is spotty in places. The woman who upgrades your weapons saying, "I know my way around a weapon." Like, how come it sounds slightly suggestive? How come her talking about knowing her way around a weapon sounds suggestive? Okay, that's a whole separate point, but voice acting is shit. Let's be honest here. Her voice acting is poor, and I think it's just bad. But for the most part, the voice acting is okay in this game. There's just a couple of characters, a couple of moments where it's a bit spotty. I think, what's his face? Gemini. Well, the game says Gemini, but it's Gemini. The word said Gemini game. But I'm going to say Gemini. If that's how he wants his name pronounced, okay. But Gemini, his voice is just annoying. I find that voice annoying. I played through a good portion of this game without sound, so I can't actually comment on the game's music, sadly. But I played through a lot of the game without sound because, don't know, I just wanted to listen to podcasts while I was playing the game. But I don't really pay attention to the story with this game. I got no clue where to begin with the story of this game, so don't ask me any questions about it. But the gameplay is good, but I got no idea about the story. But his voice was annoying anyway, from what I heard of it before I started listening to podcasts and things instead. He was annoying, but other than that, like, the voice acting is mostly good. I'd say you're talking 75% good, 25% poor. Now, one thing that I do think this game is missing is character customization. This is something that I think could have been introduced into the game quite easily. Well, I don't want to say easily. Of course, creating a whole character customization system is not going to be easy. I understand that. But I do still think, like, there wouldn't have been anything wrong with the developers just allowing you to create your own P and have that be your own character. Like, the character of P in my story is a blonde female with pigtails, because that's the character I usually play as in Dark Souls. There'd be nothing wrong with that. Like, I don't think your character is never referred to really by, well, I was going to say by their gender, but they're called the chosen boy or something like this, although I think they just say the lying one or something, don't they? I think they do refer to you as a boy several times, but I still think that the game could have made a couple of changes and allowed you to create your own character. I think it would have been good. I think I just would prefer that in terms of a role-playing thing. I would have much preferred to create my own character and allow me to get immersed more into the world in that way. I like doing that. It's just something I've always liked in all the Souls games. One of the things that I think was missing in Sekiro, but I understand. Maybe they just didn't want to do that. Maybe they wanted you to. Maybe they wanted a face, to put a face to the game. I understand that. Anyway, aside from that, I think I'm pretty much mostly done. Aside from there is mild technical and performance issues with the game. Those are probably going to be patched out, so I'm not really going to talk about those too much. But there's some instances of pop-in and things like that I understand people have had an issue with. those should be sorted out. I think there's, so I'm not going to fault the game for that. Again, it's one of their early games, this company. The last thing, I've been saving this for the end. So, earlier I mentioned boss design and how the bosses in the game are mostly fair and mostly fun, except for two bosses in this game I think are annoying, and they are both of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood boss encounters. I think this runs into the Dark Souls 2 issue, where you're faced with multiple opponents. However, sometimes in both of these boss fights, you can be doing everything in your power to memorize the boss's moves, perfect guard the boss's moves. However, when you have two enemies coming at you, there is nothing you can do. These two enemies are clearly designed separately from each other. They both have their own attack windows. They both have their own attacks, which have their own windows for you to attack in. But when you put them together, you get bullshit. That's what you get. So both the Black Rabbit Brotherhood fights are shit. Okay, I'm not going to say shit. That's a very strong word. They are weak compared to the other ones. I did not mind the eldest of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood fights because, for the most part, you're fighting the one guy. And then when you get his health down to about, you've taken away 25% of his health, then one of the other members of the Brotherhood comes in. And then the eldest one does take a back seat whilst the other one starts attacking you. However, sometimes that just doesn't happen. I'd say 60% of the time he will take the back seat and allow you to focus attention on the other one, which has now joined the fight. But then 40% of the time he just carries on like normal. Why does this happen? I don't understand why this happens. Usually he will stay at the back and then do this big running towards you jump attack, which is quite easy to jump out the way of and dodge using the dodge. You don't really want to parry that. You want to dodge and then you can get in a couple of hits on the other guy. But then, like I said, sometimes this just doesn't happen, and he'll carry on doing his normal attacks as if nothing's changed. A part of me thinks there's some AI thing going on here where it's just not realizing that someone else has joined the fight for some reason. Because when that happens, the fight is completely broken. You've got two people coming and attacking you. Their attacks are crossing over from each other. So if you parry the one, the other one's going to hit you. But if you parry the other one, the first one's going to hit you. There's nothing you can do in that scenario. It's completely bullshit. So that is something that needs to be fixed. And then the second Black Rabbit Brotherhood fight, it's exactly the same problem. Both of the Brotherhood fights have the exact same problem where attacks are crossing over from each other and there's just nothing you can do sometimes. You can dodge, you can perfect guard one attack, but something else is always going to come and fuck you up because that's just what happens. It runs into the Dark Souls 2 problem where the combat system is clearly designed for one-on-one encounters. I get the perfect guards. Yes, you could theoretically perfectly guard the attacks of two enemies who are fighting you at the same time. Yes, it's possible, yes, but it still clearly wasn't designed with that in mind. So, if you've got a boss fight like that, I think those are the only two instances, in my opinion, where the combat is just falls apart in those instances. But all the rest of the time, the combat system is perfect. I absolutely love this blend of Souls, Bloodborne and Sekiro all merge into one. I love it. It's incredibly satisfying. It's brilliant. And there's loads of different ways in which you can approach it. And I love that. There are people who have been complaining about essentially a strength build and a dexterity build, saying that a dexterity build is the way to go, and a strength build, if you're doing a tank build, is not viable in this game. But in my opinion, it is. If you use a strength build from Dark Souls, or it's a motivity build in this game, then what you want to do is, you got a big, massive, heavy greatsword, right? And it's slow, and you put loads of points into, so you wear the heaviest armor you can get, or the physical defense augmentations you can get, to be really heavy, so you fat roll, obviously. And then if you are doing a strength build with a big heavy weapon, that means that your blocks block more damage. So your weapon you'll take much less damage from hits if you block, as opposed to perfectly guard, you block. You can try and get a perfect guard if you think you can do it, but you can block, and that's perfectly fine, because the way the regain system works in this game is all the damage you block you can potentially get back by damaging your enemy. So if you've got a super strength tanky build, there's loads of people out there are saying, oh, it's just not viable at all to do that with a big heavy weapon and play a tank build because you can't dodge. I was like, well, don't fucking dodge then. Block instead. There's a whole system built into the game to allow you to block damage and then regain any health that you lose by blocking. It's perfectly fine to play that way. And all the enemies in the game have windows in which you can attack them with a slow heavy weapon. There are windows to do it. Yes, some of them, the windows are smaller and you might end up taking a hit. Yeah, that's why you have flasks to heal with, is so that you can sometimes take a hit and tank the damage. That's what a tank build's all about. I played through my first playthrough of this game using a heavy greatsword. So don't talk to me about how you can't play with a greatsword. I beat the entire game with a greatsword on my first playthrough, and because I was perfect guarding attacks, I had no issue. And I tanked some damage sometimes and it was fine. Obviously, a dexterity build, I think, would be the way to go if you wanted to dodge. You use a lighter weapon, dexterity, dodge attacks more, you can dodge around and stuff. You still have iframes. You can play that way if you want to. I think this game, in my opinion, has loads of different ways you can play it. You can dodge, you can focus on blocking, or you can perfect guard. It's a perfect blend of Bloodborne, Souls, and Sekiro, using a stamina management system, which I think was lacking from all the Souls games. So, anyway, I think that pretty much concludes this video. This video is ended up being much longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought this video was going to be 15 minutes, but I could talk about this game for hours, honestly. I love this game. This, in my personal opinion, this game is better than Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. So that might be heresy to some of you, me saying I prefer it to Dark Souls 3. But it's just my opinion, you know, I'm allowed it. I think the combat system is the main thing for me. I absolutely love the gameplay in this game, just the feel and everything. It's beautiful. It's amazing, and I really love it. So, I mean, okay, I'll say it's on par with Dark Souls 3, okay? I do really like Dark Souls. I was just thinking about some fights in that game, you know. Yeah, there's no fight in this game that's as good as Pontiff Sullivan or the Dance to the Boreal Valley, but anyway. So it's on par with Dark Souls 3 for me, okay? If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe even share this video if it was good enough. Thank you again for watching. This is Chaos Soul signing out. Have a good one.